12時10分になりましたので、始めさせていただきたいと思います。では、本日座長を務めますのは、九州大学アジア・オセアニア研究教育機構研究推進ディレクターのスコット・バレンタイン教授です。バレンタイン先生、よろしくお願いします。
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us on number 6 Brown Bag Seminar through QAOS. I'd like to extend my thanks to Obata-san and Professors Ueda and Yokota for all of their hard work in preparing a wonderful series. We have a tremendous guest joining us for today's Brown Bag Seminar, Professor Johan Lauwereyns. And Professor Lauwereyns is an interesting person to introduce because he's got so many titles. So as you can see, he's, in addition to being a professor, he's Vice President for International Affairs and Vice Dean of the School of Interdisciplinary Science and Innovation. Prof. Lauwereyns is clearly a very busy person, and we're very grateful to have him bring his expertise to today's session. Prof. Lauwereyns has a PhD in cognitive psychology, which is the scientific study of the mind as an information processor. His research interests include bioethics, meta decision making, cognitive bias, and nudging. He's been with QDI since 2010. And we are, as I've said, very grateful that he is able to share his insights of his research into the science of how we make decisions. So, Prof. Lauwereyns, thank you for coming, and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And before I begin, I would like to say thank you very much to Professor Valentine for the invitation, and Professor Ueda, Yokota, for organizing this along with Obata-san. It's a great privilege for me to be able to give this little talk. I think I have about 25 minutes, so I hope I can make that time useful. So I'd like to talk about this here meta decision making, the science of how we make decisions. So the meta part, just as in meta philosophy or metaphysics or metacognition, is essentially the science about how we make decisions, or decisions about decisions. And I want to start right away with a very straightforward example. And so imagine that you have this little girl. And this little girl has a terrible kidney disease. Suppose you have 10,000 yen you can donate. And what would you do? And so imagine that this young girl suffers from a kidney disease, and she would need expensive surgery to survive. So now, would you be willing to pay 10,000 yen to help her? And then perhaps if you would be talking with her mother directly, if you would listen to her mother's emotional plea, would you be willing to pay 10,000 yen? Now compare that to another situation. You could consider an alternative. So if you have 10,000 yen to donate, if you have that ability, if you have that extra money, you could consider offering that money to another project. And so if you pay the same amount to a project, say in a country like Sierra Leone, maybe you can actually save 5 of those cute young girls. And so what should you do? And so if we think only about the cute girl with the kidney disease, maybe we will feel strong empathy. And so it's a dokan. Maybe we will want to help in that case. But if we make a comparison, we will more likely come to a rational conclusion about how to help in the best way. So here we can see already a tension, a type of conflict emerging. And the psychologist Paul Bloom, actually in his book Against Empathy, makes exactly this argument that empathy can lead to bad decisions. And this is an interesting case because in a lot of policy making, often politicians try to emphasize how important empathy is to be a good leader. And so, for instance, somebody like former President Obama would often say, you know, to be a good leader, you need empathy. Actually, Paul Bloom says that's not the case. Empathy can actually lead to bad decisions. We need more rational ways of thinking about how to help people. So the problem is really that with empathy, we might be distracted. We might not pay attention to the whole picture. And so the rational way to help people must actually combine this compassion, this caring for other people, with economical thinking, with something more rational. And particularly, we have to think about opportunity costs. And so this word opportunity cost is interesting. It's actually a concept that comes from microeconomics. And so simply put, you could say, you know, opportunity cost is what you lose that you could have had with another choice. So whenever you choose something, it means that you don't choose for something else. And what you would have had with that something else, that's the cost, that's the opportunity cost in your choice. Now, this opportunity cost is also something we need to think about, particularly when we're trying to do good. And in a bioethics context, in trying to make the best decisions, also in a utilitarian perspective, like if we try to do the best for the most people possible. And so in this title here, this book by Peter Singer, it actually says, so the most good you can do. Sounds a little bit, you know, childish English, but it's correct. So it's the most good you can do actually requires thinking rationally, not just with the empathy. So for decision making, we actually have to think about how to combine these two things. You know, without emotions, we would be psychopaths. We would not be able to care for other people. So we do need emotions. At the same time, we need this reason, the ability to think rationally. Then I think that is very quickly put one of the key issues in meta decision making. So how do we control the decision making? So how can we make sure that we don't get sort of influenced too much by our emotions, and at the same time need to give them a proper place? I would suggest that we need to study the human mind for that. And so there's a role for cognitive science here. I want to give a little example from previous research, and previous research that very much shows how sometimes the way things are presented can influence our decisions through an emotional pathway. And so imagine here that you start out with a certain amount of money. You get, and this was a study conducted in England. You start out with 50 pounds. Now you can make a choice. You either get to keep 20 pounds or you have an option to gamble. Now, if you gamble, you have a 40% chance of keeping the lot, so 40% chance of keeping the 50 pounds, or you have a 60% chance of losing the lot. And so, what would you do? Now, interestingly, if you think about this problem as an economist, you would maybe compute the expected value. It turns out that two choices, they have the same value. And so on average, if you consider all the possibilities, on average, you would end up with 20 pounds if you gamble, but also if you choose this certain or sure option of the 20 pounds. Now, in this study conducted by these people, Raymond Dolan is one of the big researchers in this field. They actually manipulated, they did this framing manipulation, and basically just manipulating how they presented the problem. And in one case, they used a manipulation presenting the problem as something in terms of gain. You said, okay, you get to keep 20 pounds or you gamble. Alternatively, it was presented as a loss situation. It was either you lose these 30 pounds or you gamble. In reality, the two options and the two types of framing were completely equivalent. But if you look at people's behavior, the choices that they make, we see a massive effect. So if you say you either get to keep it or you lose, or you say you either get to keep it or you gamble, or you either lose or gamble, then we can now measure how likely people are to gamble. And so basically, if you talk about the possibility of keeping or gambling, people don't like to gamble. But if it's about losing versus gamble, people will gamble. So in short, when you emphasize the risk of losing, people would be more likely to gamble. When you emphasize the chance of keeping, they don't gamble. The odds are the same, but people choose different actions. And so why is this the case? This, I think, is a textbook example of what Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist, a cognitive psychologist who won a Nobel Prize for economics. This is a classic example of an effect of loss aversion. So he explained things like these in his book. It's actually a bestseller. Maybe some of you have come across it as Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman showed that we have this loss aversion. So people have an automatic reflex to get upset, particularly about the risk of losing something. And so, for instance, in terms of how much we get influenced by something, we could say that we are much more upset about the possibility of losing something than that we are excited about the possibility of gaining something. That leads to particular effects in terms of the behavior, but also if you look at the actual activity in the brain at the same time, we can see something really interesting. And so here, it looks a little bit complex, but if we go back to the idea of the frames, then we see that the dark gray bars are from the cases where the problem was presented as a loss. The light gray ones here, this kind of sort of hatched bars, are from the gain frames. And this part of the brain here, the amygdala, is a famous structure related to emotion. And so we can see that this part of the brain, this emotional part of the brain, is particularly active when we decide to go for the sure option in the gain frame. And so when we say, okay, keep something or gamble, it's better to keep. Then we see that we make such decisions with high amygdala activity. Similarly, in a loss frame, when the choice is between either losing or gambling, and we choose to gamble in that case, again, that happens with strong amygdala activity. So simply speaking, these data the data here shows that higher activity in the emotional brain areas actually correlates with this framing effect. So this framing effect of how you talk about these situations. If you emphasize the risk of losing, you want to gamble. If you emphasize the risk of keeping, you want to keep it. And so these, in a sense, intuitive kinds of behavior, they are really driven by some emotional activation. And so it's consistent with this idea of the loss aversion. Now that means that we need to be careful because in the same decision situation, when we look at it economically, the things are the same. Emotions can basically push us one way or another. Now, here it talked about the framing in terms of positive, negative, but other factors that can also influence how we make decisions include the amount of time we get. Are we working under a deadline or not? The amount of effort that's involved. The amount of information we would need to process and the number of choice options and decision rules. Now, to give a very quick example, if we're under a very strong time pressure, it tends to basically exacerbate emotional effects. Under time pressure, we get sort of influenced more by our emotions. It becomes more difficult to apply our rational thinking. So I think the science that we're trying to look at is really trying to understand which factors influence the control of decision making and to try to make formal models of this decision making. When I talk about formal models, then it is really trying to correlate the types of activity we might have in the brain towards making one decision or another, and try to see how emotional structures in the brain could lead to a bias. It's almost like an internal form of nudging towards one option versus another. And so we know that factors such as familiarity, proximity, similarity, that those factors can have an impact on how we are, nudged towards one decision versus another. And so the work that I do with colleagues here, we try to understand basically in a simple way, the mathematics that combines both the behavior and the brain activity in decision making. Now, I want to give an example of our own research and trying to show how such tweaking in the decision situation can have an impact on how people make choices. And so in this example, it's an example of making food choices. We had people look very simply at a series of images and ask them, whether they liked image, yes or no. And we created something like a shopping experiment and asked people, yes or no, whether they wanted a particular food. And so if we give this as a two-choice task, and so for each image you say yes or no whether you want it, then people spend a little bit more time looking at items that they will choose rather than at items that they will reject. So we look longer at something that we will choose. And here in this data, for instance, we looked exactly at the gaze duration. And so we measured eye movement and looked exactly how long people spent viewing images that they would choose. And so as you can see here, for images that they choose, they were looking longer than for the ones that they rejected. This result was actually consistent with something that was given in the literature and something called gaze cascade hypothesis, famous theory by Shinsuke Shimojo from Caltech. Essentially, it comes down to the idea that looking leads to liking. And so when we gaze at something, when we look at something, this is it functions as a precursor to choice. So we look, and the more we look, the more likely we take it. But in a follow-up study, we changed the choice paradigm, and we thought, like, there's something funny going on. We don't believe that looking leads to liking, and so we stepped away from the typical two-choice task, and we made it into a three-choice, more a freer version of the choice task. Here it was, instead of saying you take it or you don't, it was you take it, you choose it, or you don't, you reject it, or you defer, you put it on a wish list. And so when we did this, we found something really interesting. And so in this experiment, we had the rejected items, we had the chosen items, and the ones put on the wish list. You can see here already for the ones that were put on the wish list, that's where people were looking the longest. So this is very important data because it is not consistent with the so-called gaze cascade hypothesis. So I was very happy to tell my friend Shinsuke Shimojo, you're wrong about this. And looking does not lead to liking at all. Looking leads to thinking. Looking is just a form of thinking. And so when you think harder, then that's where you see the looking happening. And the reason why even in these data, we still get a little bit higher for yes than for no is more like a confirmation aspect. If you know that something you don't need it, you just reject. If you want it, then there is this little voice in your head that says, do you really want it? And so that takes a little bit more time. But it has nothing to do with looking leading to liking. Instead, looking is really thinking. It's integrating information. And so I think that's the type of study that we're engaging in. And so importantly, the style of decision-making changed depending on the framing of the choice options. So in this study with the food choices, we see that if you have an option to stay undecided, people checked more information. They were taking more time. In a sense, they were doing this more rationally. They were processing more information. So just tweaking it from a yes-no situation to a yes-maybe-no situation, you nudge people to think. And so I think that's a very important piece of information. And so if we zoom out a little bit, then I think we could say research like this shows very much that the way you ask the question often influences the answer you will get. And so in the first case, I talked about the girl and I asked, do you want to help this girl? And if you ask it as a yes-no situation, it's almost impossible to say no. It sounds inhuman to say no. But if you ask, should you help that girl or should you help this project in Sierra Leone, then maybe you realize that you have limited resources and that there's an obligation, a moral obligation to use those resources in the best way possible. So we need to compare, and that means using your thought to compare. In the second example with the food, again, we saw that if you just make yes, no decisions in a categorical way, maybe we get sort of swayed more by our emotions. If we ask yes, maybe no, we spend more time thinking and carefully investigating what the options are. This is important information. This range of research, like how you ask the question, influences the answer you get, but also the thought processes. I think that's really the topic of meta decision making. And I would suggest this is very much a dual use kind of knowledge. And this dual use is a concept that we often use in bioethics. And so dual use means there are two ways you can use it. You can use it in a good way, or you can use it in a bad way. And a classic example of dual use was with nuclear physics. You can use it in a good way to try to create energy, or in a bad way to try to create atom bombs and destroy the Earth. Other examples would be research into viruses. And research into viruses can help us create vaccines and protect people, but it also could, in the hands of criminals or terrorists, lead to creating weapons of mass destruction, biochemical weapons. In the same way here, I think knowing how we can manipulate people's choices and ability to nudge people one way or another, if we are not careful about that, this can be exploited in ways that are not fair or that are politically suspect. And I think in that sense, knowing more and better about how this works will also enable us to make better decisions and to protect against, inappropriate influences. So, and this is my last slide. I think, and this is also where I feel happy as a cognitive scientist / bioethicist, this kind of research is exactly where science meets ethics. And so we need to understand the cognitive and the neural mechanisms. And at the same time, we need to understand how this knowledge is relevant, important even, in policy making and thinking about bioethics, but also more generally, any kind of decision about people's lives and even branching out to any aspect of human endeavors. On that note, I have talked exactly now 25 minutes. That's right here. So I'm going to say thank you very much, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think.
Great. Thank you very much, Prof. Lauwereyns. I could, you know what, I'm hoping nobody asks any questions, because I could talk about this all day. I have millions of questions for you. Could I please remind those of you who are in the audience and who might have some questions to pop them in the chat box. So もし質問何かあればチャットの方に入れてくださいませんか。We have one question from Prof. Yokota. He's asking, what do you think the role of empathy played in regard to decision-making regarding COVID-19 vaccine distribution, in particular in developing versus developed countries?
Okay, yeah, I think this is a brilliant question. It calls to mind a famous case early on in the vaccine distribution in the US, where doctors who got access to the vaccines actually put some of those dosages aside for their family. And so that you get corruption happening. And so the empathy in caring for your nearest ones makes it very difficult to sometimes do fair decision making. Now, this at the individual level, where people get swayed by their emotions to actually make bad, or I would say totally corrupt decisions. At a larger scale, you can see that happening for COVID-19. And if you see, for instance, in Hong Kong now, we're looking at 2 million vaccine dosages that are going to be wasted, and they are not being distributed. They're not being shared with developed countries. So in terms of bioethics, we can say that we're nowhere near achieving this idea of doing the most good for people. And what happens here in an international sense is that the vaccine distribution is now leading to a competition among nations and states as agents. And if you look at how they're behaving, it's basically just selfish behavior. At the same time, also in other countries, and I think Australia and Japan go in there, they may have shown some complacency that in their own countries, there was not such an excessive number of COVID cases, that people have not invested as much in developing vaccines as they could. And in the same instance, those decisions about how much would time and effort and resources would be invested in developing vaccines, it's always been thought of country by country. And so never an idea of creating extra for developing countries, for instance. And that's, yeah.
What a fascinating statement you made at the beginning. You were talking about corruption in developing countries and how that influences participation and willingness to contribute to resolving problems. So am I correct in assuming that really that's akin to the slide that you put up, where you've got a case of gamble on one side and loss on the other?
Absolutely, yes. And so I think when we are focused on the possibility of losing things, it just hypercharges our emotions. And in that sense, it does not allow us to think and compare rationally about how to help the most people. And so I think there, Paul Bloom makes this distinction between empathy and compassion. And I think there's something to it. Empathy is something that arouses, is an emotion that makes us either angry or somehow it impassions. And it's also shown, for instance, that nurses who have strong empathy tend to be more likely to get burnout relatively early in their career, because they get upset too much, and it eats into their energy levels. Whereas people who show compassion, they basically use their reasonable, so the comparative thinking to basically see what is the best way to help people. And so it's taking an appropriate level of distance to be able to see better how you can have an impact for the most people. And so that means you have to disengage from an immediate emotional reaction, and you have to kind of sort of take a bit of a stance from where you can see the horizon and then compare. And so that actually means really managing your emotion. So almost like anger management, but sort of emotion management. Yes.
That statement is a perfect segue into the next question. Prof. Yokota also asks, in regard to the decision on the Tokyo Olympics, so talk about anger management, to what degree do you feel that time, effort, information amount, choice option, and decision rules, so the elements that you presented on your PowerPoint, played a role in how this decision is unfolding?
Oh yeah, there are so many factors playing in, but I think what we call in microeconomics and also in cognitive science is sunk costs. Maybe I should write that. I'm not sure. Sunk costs. So sunk costs is a concept in microeconomics that reflects like how much time and effort you've already invested in something, and which is what you would lose if you give up. And so in the Olympics, from both the IOC and Japan as a nation, from various perspectives, and even all the athletes involved, there are already sort of huge amounts of sunk costs, which make it almost impossible to think rationally about what is the best option right now. And so somehow, instead of cutting your losses and not thinking about what you've invested and try to see what is the best way forward, it is very difficult to make a decision. And of course, right now, we're sitting very close to a deadline, which further exacerbates the role of emotions in these decisions. I think a particular difficulty.
What would your advice be to the Japanese government if they wished to influence public decision making?
Yeah, I think in some sense, Japan doesn't have the authority to call off the Olympics, and that's the IOC, and that's the big issue. But I think Japan could create a coalition with countries, and including United States and other big players, and saying, like, if everybody agrees, like, okay, this is not the right time to hold the Olympics, then that amount of pressure could lead to the IOC to buckle under the weight. And so I think at the moment, Japan is, and the Japanese government is negotiating with the IOC on a one-on-one basis. I would step away from that and put a coalition of pressure on the IOC. And ultimately, it might also be interesting to see, just I think there's, this is difficult to gauge, of course, but my sense is that there is enough support toward the idea of canceling the Olympics in Japan that maybe the government should just do a rational calculation of just how much it would lose with the IOC contracts and just take that loss in favor of dealing properly with the pandemic.
My question to you was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it goes back to one of the slides that you showed us on images of the amygdala and how that responds to conditions of loss and gain. Because when you showed that slide, one of the questions I had to myself was, is it possible to condition the amygdala in a way to ensure that that the emotions that arise due to these time pressures, effort, information amount, to ensure that the brain can rationally deal with this, even though it is facing these types of constraints that would normally cause an emotional response?
Absolutely. So I actually showed only the top half of that data slide. And maybe I wonder if I have a little bit of time to go back to that slide. So if I go to the data slide here, I hope you can see it.
Yeah. Yes.
So I only talked about the top half here, the amygdala. And now the bottom half here, the ACC, is the anterior cingulate cortex. And we could say this is our effort control area in the brain. This is the part of the brain that gives us the motivation to do something difficult. And now you can see that I mainly talked about the cases in the amygdala activation when you go for the sure option on the gain frame and when you go for the gamble option in the loss frame. So these are the typical things we do under the sort of loss aversion. But one thing to point out is that this is obviously only a tendency. And so even in the gain frame, we're seeing people sometimes gamble. And even in the loss frame, sometimes they go for the sure option. So there is an amount of realization that if you compute those two, if you think about it economically, that the options that were given here, that they are actually equivalent. So if you think about it, you can see actually it shouldn't matter. And the problem is that our emotions interfere with the thinking. And now, if we look at the anterior cingulate cortex activity, we see that when people go for the gamble option in the gain frame, or when they go for the sure option in the loss frame, and this is actually going against your emotions, going against the loss aversion, that seems to coincide with this anterior cingulate cortex activation. So the short and long of it here is that we have this control mechanism for our emotions, and that's the anterior cingulate cortex. And the point is about how to train ourselves to do that effort. And I think it is a question of creating a habit to look for different options instead of allowing yourself to be locked into a deadline, or instead of allowing yourself to be locked into a yes-no situation, deliberately sort of step back and see, is there another option? Is there another way I can gain more time? So this creativity, this stepping out of a categorical decision situation, often is the best way to deal with our emotions. And so literally it's about disengaging in an immediate choice.
Professor Johan Lauwereyns, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. A fascinating talk today, and I wish we could continue. On behalf of QAOS, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time, and those of you who have joined us, I'd like to thank you for coming and joining. If you wouldn't mind holding on for one more minute, I believe Obata-san would like to put up a slide that just serves to convey who our speaker is next week. So with that said, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lauwereyns and Scott Valentine. はい、ありがとうございました。では最後に事務局より2点ご案内させていただきます。来週のご案内になります。来週同じ水曜日ですね、6月2日の水曜日12時10分より、工学研究員の大賀徹先生より、グローバルパートナーシップのための都市のグローバル化、福岡市の国際化、脱国境化、地域化、地方化について、ご講演をいただきます。詳細はホームページをご覧ください。